You've tuned in to episode 8 of The Luminary Room with Nico, writer, published author and the voice behind 369 Lumineer. The Luminary Room has been designed to be a space for those who question, reflect and seek truth, where we look beyond what's being presented to what's really there. No conspiracy, no blind acceptance, just the pursuit of what's real. And each episode, a sharp 15-minute illumination. In this episode, we take on one of history's most enduring lies, how history rewrote the witch. If you're old enough, you'll remember the 60s TV show Bewitched, or for the younger listeners, Charmed, Buffy, or even the Vampire Diaries. There were witches portrayed in each of these shows. In Bewitched, for example, Samantha Stephens, played by the intelligent and brilliant Elizabeth Montgomery, was smiling, suburban, her magic hidden behind charm and good manners. She could simply twitch her nose and change the world around her, but only within the walls of her house. Even as late as the 1960s, when Bewitched first aired, the magic of the witch needed to be confined, hidden behind the familiar and safe domestic setting. The joke wasn't just about magic, it was about containing the power of a woman who could act independently, who could disrupt the order if given the space. That sanitised version of the witch, smiling and polite, masked the truth of what had been feared for centuries. And that is the lie we've been sold. Because the witch, the real witch, was never wicked. She was rewritten. When you hear the word witch, what image comes to mind? Let me guess, a crooked nose, a black hat, a green face maybe, or even a broomstick. You've seen it before, somewhere between The Wizard of Oz and every Halloween costume since. You probably picture an old woman alone in the woods, muttering spells and stirring a cauldron, an image Shakespeare helped cement. It was built over centuries to erase something far older and far more human, because once a witch was not a villain. The concept stretches back millennia. In ancient Egypt, women served as priestesses and healers, working with herbs, incantations, and sacred rituals to protect and nurture communities. In Greece, the wise women, often called pharmakis, offered remedies, fertility advice, and guidance while commanding deep respect. These were women whose knowledge was practical, spiritual, and vital, long before the church or the state sought to redefine them. She was a healer, a midwife, a woman who understood the rhythms of the earth, the uses of herbs, the pull of the moon. She treated fever with willow bark, eased childbirth with roots and oils, and read the weather by the behaviour of birds. She was knowledge made flesh, and that made her dangerous. In medieval Europe, knowledge was supposed to belong to men. Universities were closed to women. Latin was the language of authority, and medicine, law, and theology were monopolised by male scholars and clerics. To read, write, or even understand these systems was considered outside the proper sphere for women. Their wisdom, practical and inherited through generations, existed only in secret, and that secrecy alone was enough to raise suspicion. Doctors trained in Latin, priests who read scripture, kings who issued decrees. But women, especially older women, widows, the ones with no husband or son to protect them, held something the system couldn't control. Experience, folk memory. The kind of wisdom that didn't come from a university but from the body, from the land, from generations of women teaching women, had been cultivated over centuries. In the Middle Ages, this knowledge was intertwined with agricultural cycles, herbal medicine and midwifery. Records suggest that by the 1200s, local communities still relied on cunning folk for remedies, but the church increasingly sought to codify and control what knowledge counted as legitimate, sowing suspicion about those who passed wisdom outside sanctioned institutions. By the 1400s, that tension had escalated into systematic persecution. By the late 1400s, that independence became intolerable. In 1486, a Dominican friar named Heinrich Kramer published Malleus Maleficarum, The Hammer of Witches. It became one of the most dangerous books ever printed. It claimed that women were inherently deceitful, lustful, and more susceptible to the devil's influence. Its logic was circular and its theology brutal. Kramer claimed that all women were innately deceitful and more susceptible to the devil, yet offered no empirical evidence, only fear and anecdote. He argued that women's sexuality was inherently dangerous and that midwives, widows and wise women were portals to evil. Modern historians recognise Malleus Maleficarum as propaganda, a calculated attempt to demonise independent women under the guise of religious authority, weaponising superstition to consolidate power and control wealth. But it gave the church, and later the state, a manual for persecution. Tens of thousands of women were tried, tortured and executed across Europe, England, Scotland, Germany, France. In some regions like Würzburg and Bamberg in Germany, entire towns were swept into mass trials in the early 1600s, where over 900 women were executed in a single campaign. These purges devastated communities, leaving orphan children, abandoned homes, and centuries of oral knowledge destroyed. Communities turned on their own neighbours, and behind the moral panic sat a familiar motivation: profit. When an accused witch was killed, her property was confiscated. If she was widowed, her house and land often went to the church or the crown. Burning so-called wicked women was not only moral theatre, it was economic strategy, a form of asset transfer disguised as divine justice. Once, these women were called wise women, cunning folk, or midwives. Their healing practices were rooted in what we might now call natural medicine, herbalism, astrology, and a deep awareness of the cycles of nature. They knew when to plant, when to harvest, when to rest. They lived by rhythms that the church could not sanctify. To undermine them, those rhythms had to be demonised, so fertility rites became orgies, healing circles became Sabbaths, the goddess became the devil. This was psychological warfare. Erase the feminine from the sacred, replace it with sin, and convince generations that the power once associated with women was dangerous, dirty, and unnatural. And it worked. By the 17th century, the archetype of the witch had shifted from healer to monster, a grotesque symbol of female transgression. You can see transformation in art and literature. Shakespeare's Macbeth, written in the early 1600s, is a turning point. The three weird sisters, those witches whispering prophecies, weren't just there for atmosphere. Shakespeare gives them lines like double toil and trouble, fire burn and cauldron bubble, embedding the sense of menace and unnatural interference into the play. These words turned what could have been mysterious guidance into a symbol of fear and chaos, reinforcing the cultural template of the dangerous, destructive witch. They were a political choice. King James I, who ruled England at the time, had a personal obsession with witchcraft. He even wrote a treatise called Demonology, arguing for the hunting of witches. In it, he examined cases of witchcraft, categorised different forms of maleficia, and offered guidance on how courts should detect, interrogate, and punish witches. The work combined legal reasoning, theology, and superstition, and it influenced English witch trials for decades. It was both a manual and a warning. Women who stepped outside social norms risked scrutiny, accusation, and death. Shakespeare knew his audience. The witches in Macbeth were crafted to feed the king's fears and the public's imagination. They became agents of chaos, whispering temptation, driving men to evil. From that moment on, the witch was cemented in popular culture as the harbinger of ruin. The myth was complete. Now, let's fast forward to the 20th century. The Wizard of Oz, Hollywood's great fairy tale. The Wicked Witch of the West. Green-skinned, shrieking, vengeful, flying evil monkeys embodied every patriarchal nightmare of female autonomy. Meanwhile, Glinda, the supposed good witch, who, as an aside, was in fact the bad version of the two if you look deep enough into the story, she was young, blonde, smiling, compliant. Goodness therefore became synonymous with beauty. Power became ugliness. The divine feminine, in all its autonomy, intelligence and vitality, was recast as grotesque. Youth, beauty and compliance were rewarded in women. Wisdom, experience and self-determination were vilified. In this system, female authority could only exist if stripped of its spiritual or political potency, leaving the witch as the embodiment of everything patriarchal society feared about women who could think, heal, or act freely. And the archetype carried forward again, quietly reinforcing the same binary. The obedient woman is rewarded, the independent one destroyed. But what about the truth? Who were these women really? If you step back before the trials, before the propaganda, you find something else entirely. Across ancient Europe, across Ireland and the Celtic lands, across Italy and the Germanic forests, women gathered herbs not to curse, but to cure. They honoured the moon because it mirrored the cycle of life and death, of fertility and rest. These practices were inherited from ancestors who had observed the seasons, the stars, and the cycles of birth and harvest for millennia. From Mesopotamia to Greece, from Celtic tribes to pre-Christian Northern Europe, women served as custodians of medicinal herbs, lunar knowledge, and communal rites. Their methods were empirical, developed over generations, and rooted in the survival and flourishing of their communities. They practiced a form of community care long before medicine was institutionalised. In Ireland, even today, the term wise woman or bunfasa still carries respect. It means the woman who knows, the one you turn to for remedies, guidance, or protection. In some rural parts, she's still called a witch, but said with reverence, not fear or hatred. These are fragments of what survived the fire. But let's also not forget Salem, probably the most famous of all witch trials, the one that's haunted our films, our TV shows, our books, and even our imagination. By the time the witch trials reached Puritan America in the late 1600s, the hysteria had become cultural export. In a society built on rigid religious control, the witch became a convenient scapegoat. Again, this time for social unrest, economic tension, and fear of female independence. It is recorded that 19 women were executed in Salem. They faced methods designed to guarantee terror. Some were pressed under heavy stones, others were drowned in attempts to test their innocence. If they floated, their survival was proof of witchcraft. If they sank, they died anyway. Many were hanged, a few faced the stake. These executions were inhumane, ritualised cruelty masquerading as justice, leaving no path to survival and no mercy for those accused. But the trial records reveal something chillingly familiar. Many of those accused were women who inherited land, spoke out, or simply didn't fit into the mould of obedient womanhood. It wasn't about sorcery, it was about control. If you trace this line through history, a pattern emerges. Whenever women gain too much knowledge, too much influence, or too much independence, the label witch resurfaced. Consider Joan of Arc, condemned as a heretic and executed at the stake in 1431. Her military leadership, visions, and refusal to conform to traditional female roles marked her as dangerous in the eyes of patriarchal authority. Her persecution fits the same pattern of demonising empowered women, not as a description, but as a weapon. So what happens when we strip away the propaganda? What remains? Well, we see the witch not as a figure of evil, but as one of resistance, a symbol of the human instinct to heal, to connect, to remember what the world tried to make us forget. And that's why today many are reclaiming the word. Artists, healers, herbalists, spiritual practitioners. They're taking back what was stolen. They're saying the witch was never wicked. She was wise. The persecution was the lie. For centuries, we've been taught to fear the woman who lives outside the system, the one who doesn't need permission to understand the world. But maybe she's the only one who saw it most clearly all along. The word witch is not a curse, it's a lens. And what it reveals is less about her than about those who feared, misunderstood, or sought to control her. If this session on how history rewrote the witch made you pause, or even challenged what you thought you knew, then it's done exactly what it was meant to do. Subscribe, like and share. Every listener helps illuminate the stories that have been hidden, erased or distorted for centuries. You have been listening to the Luminary Room, where we don't just accept the tales we're told, but step back, question them and reclaim the truths that history tried to burn. This is 369 Lumineer signing off.